You think digging a lake makes you special sweetheart? You are just a landscape destroyer on our community's land. The woman in the ivory blazer stood at my front gate, a handheld megaphone pressed to her lips. Her dark brown hair pinned up as though she were about to enter a courtroom. She was certain she would win. Behind her, 4 police cruisers had surrounded my home, their red and blue lights cutting through the morning mist. Officers stood waiting by their vehicles, hands resting near their belts. Residents from Pinewood Ridge lined the street, phones raised high, recording what they clearly expected to be the public execution of one man's dream. Comment below where you are watching from. I did not move from my fishing chair by the lake. The water lay perfectly still at 6:47 a.m., reflecting the chaos at my gate like a mirror that refused to participate in the drama. My name is Garrett Mercer. I am 44 years old. I spent 20 years as a senior hydraulic engineer for the United States Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in federal water disputes and land rights litigation. The woman with the megaphone, Brenda Whitmore, had been HOA president for 7 years. She had sent me 12 warning letters about this lake. She had threatened fines, liens, and foreclosure. This was not her first time weaponizing law enforcement. Last year, she called in a hazmat team because a neighbor composted in his backyard. The year before, she reported a retired school teacher for suspicious gatherings that turned out to be a weekly book club. The police had learned to expect exaggeration from Pinewood Ridge, which explained why Chief Mitchell himself had come, likely hoping to resolve whatever theatrical complaint had landed on his desk before it wasted more department resources. The police chief, a stocky man with graying temples and tired eyes, walked toward me across the grass. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though he was not entirely sure why he was here. Behind him, Brenda Whitmore's voice continued its assault through the megaphone, but the words had become background noise, static against the morning birds. Chief Mitchell stopped about 10 feet from my chair and looked at the lake, then at me, then back at the lake. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his tone more confused than authoritative. "We received a report of suspicious activity. The HOA claims you are operating an unlicensed industrial facility on residential property." I set down my fishing rod and turned to face him fully. "An industrial facility," I repeated, letting the absurdity hang in the air. "Chief Mitchell, does this look like an industrial facility to you?" He glanced around. The lake stretched across 2 acres, its surface dotted with lily pads and a small wooden dock I had built myself. Cattails swayed along the eastern shore. A family of ducks paddled near the center, oblivious to the crisis supposedly unfolding around them. There were no machines, no chemicals, no structures beyond a small storage shed. Chief Mitchell scratched the back of his neck and exhaled slowly. "Sir, I have to be honest with you. We received the call at 5:30 this morning. The complaint described hazardous materials, illegal excavation, and potential environmental contamination." He paused, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I am not seeing any of that here." I nodded and reached for the file beside my chair. 217 pages I had compiled specifically for moments like this. "That is because none of it exists. Chief, this lake took 18 months to construct. I paid $125,000 out of my own savings." I handed him the top document, a laminated copy of my EPA environmental clearance dated March 15th, 2 years ago, then showed him the county excavation permit and the state water rights approval beneath it. He studied each one carefully, his brow furrowing deeper with each signature and official stamp. Behind us, Brenda Whitmore had stopped speaking. The silence felt heavier than her accusations. I glanced toward the gate and saw her standing with her phone raised, recording everything. Not broadcasting anymore, just collecting footage, storing ammunition for whatever battle she planned next. Chief Mitchell handed the documents back to me and cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer, I apologize for the disruption. Based on what I am seeing here, there does not appear to be any violation. The complaint described circumstances that do not match reality." He hesitated, then added quietly, "I would recommend you document everything going forward. Keep copies of all communications." I met his eyes and saw something there, a warning, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that he understood more than he could officially say. I have been documenting for 6 months. Chief. Every letter, every threat, every violation of my property rights. He nodded once, then turned and walked back toward his cruiser. The other officers followed, their postures visibly relaxed now that the imagined crisis had dissolved into nothing. Engines started. The lights shut off. One by one, the 4 cruisers pulled away from my gate and disappeared down the tree-lined street. But Brenda Whitmore did not leave. She crossed the gate threshold and walked directly toward me, her heels sinking slightly into the grass with each step. The neighbors had dispersed, returning to their morning routines now that the spectacle had fizzled. It was just the 2 of us now, standing on opposite sides of the lake I had built to heal myself after my wife died. She stopped 6 feet away, close enough that I could see the calculation in her eyes. "You think you won something today, Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was quieter now, almost intimate, stripped of the performance she had given for the cameras. "The police cannot help you. The county permits do not matter. This is a community governed by covenants, and you have violated those covenants for the last time." I said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence unnerves people who expect argument. She waited for a response that never came, and I watched irritation flicker across her features. "Tomorrow night," she continued, her smile returning, cold and precise. "Emergency HOA meeting, 7 p.m. at the community center. The board will vote on enforcement action, fines, liens, foreclosure proceedings if necessary." She tilted her head slightly. "And just so we are clear, Mr. Mercer, you do not have voting rights. Your dues payment arrived at 4:12 p.m. on the 30th, but our bylaws specify a noon deadline, which means you were technically late by 4 hours and 12 minutes. She let that sink in, savoring my silence. "Automatic suspension of membership privileges for 30 days. You can attend, you can watch, but you cannot speak, and you certainly cannot vote." It was a loophole so absurd it bordered on parody, yet I could see she had crafted it deliberately, burying the noon deadline in a bylaw amendment passed 18 months ago when no one was paying attention. She turned and walked away before I could respond, her silhouette shrinking against the morning light. I looked down at the file in my hands and realized permits were not enough. She was not fighting me on legal grounds. She was fighting me on procedural territory she had spent 7 years learning to manipulate. I needed to understand why she wanted me gone so badly. And as I replayed her budget presentation from last month, one detail surfaced. Landscaping maintenance costs had increased by 340% in 3 years. But the landscaping looked the same. The community center smelled of stale coffee and tension when I walked through the doors at 6:55 p.m. the following evening. 47 residents had already taken their seats, arranged in neat rows, facing a long table where Brenda Whitmore sat flanked by 4 board members. A projector hummed in the corner, casting the HOA logo onto a pull-down screen. I found an empty chair in the back row, nodding to the few neighbors who still made eye contact. Most did not. Word had spread about the police visit, though the details had mutated in the retelling by now. Half the neighborhood believed I was running some kind of illegal operation. The other half simply did not want to get involved. I understood. I had been that person once, the one who looked away when someone else faced the machine. That was before the machine turned its gears toward me. Brenda stood and tapped the microphone twice, her smile radiating the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As you know, we have a serious matter to address regarding a property that has violated our community covenants for over 18 months. She clicked a remote, and the first slide appeared. My name, my address, a photograph of my lake taken from what appeared to be a drone. I had not authorized any drone flights over my property, but I filed that detail away for later. "Mr. Mercer's unauthorized water feature," she continued, emphasizing the word unauthorized as though it were a criminal designation, "has created multiple violations that affect every single one of you." She clicked again. 23 slides followed, each more absurd than the last. Violation number 1 claimed my lake produced frog noise exceeding 45 decibels at night, disrupting neighborhood sleep patterns. I had measured the sound myself. 32 decibels, quieter than a refrigerator. Violation number 2 alleged that sunlight reflecting off the water surface caused visual impairment to residents on the western boundary. There were no residents on the western boundary. That lot had been vacant for 6 years. The violations continued. Unauthorized wildlife attraction, specifically ducks that had migrated naturally and were protected under federal law. Water coloration outside the 847 approved shades in the community aesthetic guidelines. Potential property value reduction based on a study that did not exist, conducted by an expert whom no one could remember. I watched the faces around me as Brenda presented each accusation with theatrical gravity. Some residents nodded along, accepting each claim without question. Others shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing the absurdity but unwilling to voice it. When she reached slide 23, Brenda paused for effect. Based on these documented violations, the board recommends immediate enforcement action, a fine of $500 per day until the water feature is removed, placement of a lien on the property, and if Mr. Mercer fails to comply within 30 days, we will initiate foreclosure proceedings under Article 14, Section 7 of our covenants. She let the word foreclosure hang in the air like a verdict already delivered. 35 hands rose when she called for the vote. 12 opposed. I was not permitted to raise mine, but I was permitted to speak during the public comment period, a technicality Brenda had apparently overlooked. I stood before she could adjourn. Point of order. Madam President. The room went quiet. Brenda's smile flickered, but held. Mr. Mercer, your membership privileges are suspended. You cannot participate in official proceedings. I remained standing. Public comment is not an official proceeding. It is a courtesy extended to all residents, including those with suspended voting rights. Page 47 of the bylaws you amended 18 months ago. I watched her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She had written those bylaws herself, and she knew I was correct. You have 2 minutes, she said, her voice flat. I did not need 2 minutes. I needed 30 seconds. Article 14. Section 7 grants the HOA enforcement authority over structures within the common planning area. My lake is not within the common planning area. It sits on privately deeded land that was excluded from HOA jurisdiction in the original subdivision plat, filed with Jefferson County in 1994. Your enforcement authority ends at my property line. Silence. Brenda's smile vanished entirely. Our legal counsel disagrees with your interpretation, she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. Then your legal counsel has not read the plat, I replied. I have. I also have 20 years of experience reading documents exactly like it. I sat down. The meeting adjourned 12 minutes later, but the damage was already spreading. 3 neighbors who had greeted me that morning walked past without acknowledgement. When I returned home, someone had spray-painted the words, "Drain the swamp," across my fence in red letters. My daughter called at 11:15 p.m., her voice strained with worry. She had seen footage of the police visit circulating online, recut and captioned to make me look like a criminal. Dad, what is happening out there? I told her I was handling it. I told her not to worry. But after we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the HOA financial report Brenda had distributed at the meeting. The numbers blurred as I scrolled through pages of mundane expenses, until one line item stopped me cold. Legal consulting fees, $89,000 over 3 years, paid to a firm I had never heard of. I searched the firm's registered address. It was Brenda Whitmore's home. By day 15, the fines had accumulated to $7,500. The letters arrived daily now, each one more threatening than the last, printed on HOA letterhead with language designed to sound legal, but crafted primarily to intimidate. The most recent one warned of an impending lien on my property title, a claim that would attach to my deed and follow me if I ever tried to sell or refinance. I had not slept more than 3 hours a night since the meeting. The exhaustion sat behind my eyes like sand, making everything slightly unreal. My neighbors had stopped acknowledging me entirely. Even the ones who had smiled politely before now crossed the street when they saw me approaching. Someone had thrown a rock through the window of my storage shed by the lake, scattering glass across the dock where I used to sit with my wife during her final summer. I swept up the shards in silence. refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me break. The phone call from my bank came on a Tuesday morning. A pleasant-voiced woman named Karen from the mortgage department wanted to confirm some information. "Mr. Mercer, we have received notification of a pending legal dispute involving your property. This may affect your loan status and could trigger a review of your terms." I explained that the dispute was baseless, that I had permits for everything, and that the HOA was overreaching. She listened politely and said she would note my response in the file, but her tone suggested the note would change nothing. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the stack of documents I had been accumulating: permits, letters, bylaws, and meeting minutes. Evidence of harassment, but not enough to explain why. Then I remembered the request I had filed 2 weeks earlier under the Colorado Open Records Act. I checked my email and found the response waiting in my inbox: the HOA's financial records for the past 5 years, delivered as required by law. I downloaded the files and began to review. What I found made the harassment suddenly make sense. The numbers told a story Brenda Whitmore had clearly never expected anyone to piece together. $127,000 paid to legal consulting services over 3 years, yet there were no contracts, no invoices, no evidence of any actual legal work beyond the occasional threatening letter. $89,000 allocated for security upgrades in a community that had exactly 4 cameras, worth perhaps $2,000 total at retail prices. $340,000 was designated for a park renovation project that had never happened. The park looked exactly as it had when I moved here 3 years ago. The same faded benches, the same cracked walking path, the same rusted playground equipment. I ran the numbers twice. Then a third time. Someone had been siphoning money from the HOA for years, hiding the theft behind vague line items and inflated budgets. And if my suspicions were correct about the legal consulting firm registered at Brenda's home address, I was beginning to understand who. I needed help. Not legal help. Not yet. I needed someone who understood accounting, someone who could look at these numbers and confirm what I was seeing. The next morning, I found that person sitting on his front porch 3 houses down. Frank Morrison was 67 years old, a retired certified public accountant who had spent 30 years auditing corporations for a major firm in Denver. He was also the only neighbor who still waved when I passed. I walked up his driveway and asked if he had a few minutes to talk. He invited me inside, poured 2 cups of coffee, and listened without interruption as I explained what I had found. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I asked about the budget once," he finally said, his voice carrying the weight of something he had buried. "Last year's annual meeting. I pointed out some inconsistencies in the landscaping expenses. Nothing accusatory, just questions." He paused, staring into his coffee. "The next week, someone spray-painted my car in my own driveway. Red paint. Impossible to remove without a full repaint. I got the message. I have been quiet ever since." Frank agreed to review the financial documents with me, but only in private. We spent the next 3 hours at his kitchen table, cross-referencing receipts with bank statements, tracking payments to vendors that did not seem to exist. By evening, we had identified over $800,000 in questionable expenses spanning 7 years, the entire duration of Brenda Whitmore's presidency. "This is embezzlement," Frank said quietly, pushing his glasses up his nose. "If these numbers are accurate, she has been stealing from every homeowner in this community." I asked about legal options, and he mentioned Colorado Revised Statutes, Section 38, Chapter 33.3, Subsection 209, Fiduciary Duty. The board was legally obligated to manage HOA funds responsibly. Violation could result in civil liability and potentially criminal charges. Before I left, Frank mentioned one more name: Harold Brennan, the HOA treasurer who had resigned abruptly 4 years ago and moved to Florida without explanation. "Nobody knows why he left so suddenly," Frank said. "But if anyone knows where the bodies are buried, it would be him." I returned home to find a certified letter waiting in my mailbox. Official notice from the HOA's attorney. They were filing suit to enforce the lien and compel the removal of my lake. Preliminary hearing scheduled in 45 days. Attached was a demand for $15,000 in accumulated fines. Due within 10 days. With 18% annual interest on any unpaid balance. I set the letter on my table and picked up my phone. "Frank," I said when he answered, "do you have a phone number for Harold Brennan?" Harold Brennan answered on the fourth ring. His voice was thin and cautious, the voice of a man who had spent 4 years waiting for a call he both dreaded and expected. "Who gave you this number?" he asked before I could introduce myself. I told him Frank Morrison had, and the silence that followed stretched long enough that I thought he had hung up. Then he exhaled slowly. "The lake on Maple Drive," he said. "You are the one they are trying to destroy." I confirmed that I was, and something shifted in his tone. "I have been waiting for someone to fight back. I was too afraid to do it myself. That is something I will regret until the day I die." He agreed to talk, but not over the phone. 3 days later, I drove 9 hours to Sarasota, Florida, to meet a 71-year-old man who held the keys to everything. Harold lived in a modest condo overlooking a golf course, a world away from the mountains of Colorado. He greeted me at the door with a handshake that trembled slightly, then led me to a small office where cardboard boxes lined the walls. "I kept copies of everything," he said, pulling a thick folder from the nearest box. "When I was treasurer, I noticed discrepancies in the books almost immediately. Small amounts at first, a few thousand here and there, but by my second year, the pattern was unmistakable." He spread documents across his desk, pointing to entries I recognized from the records I had obtained. The same inflated expenses, the same phantom vendors. The same money is disappearing into accounts that should not exist. But Harold had something I did not. He had the original ledgers, the ones Brenda had replaced with sanitized versions after he resigned, side by side. The difference was staggering. $847,000 over 7 years, systematically drained from a community that trusted its leaders. Harold explained how the scheme worked. Brenda created invoices for services never rendered, approved payments to companies owned by her husband Richard, and buried the transactions in budget categories no one ever questioned. When Harold confronted her privately in 2021, she did not deny it. Instead, she smiled and told him that if he spoke publicly, she would claim he had been the one stealing. She had already prepared documentation implicating him, forged signatures, and altered records ready to deploy. "She gave me a choice," Harold said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Resign quietly and keep my reputation, or fight and lose everything. I chose the coward's path. I ran." He handed me a USB drive containing every document he had preserved. Emails between Brenda and Richard discussing transfers, bank statements showing deposits into offshore accounts, a paper trail so damning that I wondered how she had slept at night for 7 years. I returned to Colorado with enough evidence to bury Brenda Whitmore, but I knew better than to move too quickly. The next morning, I contacted Diana Ross, a 52-year-old attorney who had spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor before entering private practice. Her specialty was financial crimes, and her reputation for methodical, devastating cases preceded her. We met at her office in downtown Denver, where I laid out everything Harold had given me, plus the records I had gathered myself. She reviewed the material in silence for nearly an hour, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim but focused. "This is embezzlement under Colorado Criminal Code Section 18, Chapter 4, Subsection 401. Anything over $100,000 is a Class 3 felony. If these documents are authentic, she is looking at 4 to 12 years in federal prison, plus full restitution." Diana outlined our strategy. First, we would file a formal complaint with the Colorado Attorney General's office, triggering an official investigation. Second, we would subpoena the HOA's bank records as part of a civil countersuit against the lien they had filed on my property. Third, and most importantly, we would wait. That evening, I installed security cameras around my property. Someone had been watching my house. I was certain of it. Twice in the past week, I had noticed an unfamiliar car parked at the end of my street, engine idling, the graffiti on my fence, the broken window. These were not random acts. There were warnings from someone who knew I was getting close. Frank called at 9:30 p.m. to share another discovery. He had traced a $67,000 invoice for road repairs in the neighborhood. The invoice was dated March of 2023 and marked as paid in full. The only problem was that no roads in Pinewood Ridge had been repaired that year. The asphalt cracks Frank photographed that afternoon matched images from 3 years earlier. Unchanged. We were building a case, brick by brick. Then the email arrived. No sender name. No signature. Just a single paragraph. I work in the HOA office. I have what you need. Meet me at the coffee shop on Main Street. At 7 p.m. Saturday. Come alone. Tell no one. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. Someone inside Brenda's own organization wanted to talk. The walls were beginning to close, and not around me. Susan Palmer was waiting at a corner table when I arrived at the coffee shop at 6:55 p.m. on Saturday. She was younger than I expected, 34 years old, with nervous hands that kept wrapping and unwrapping around her cup. She had worked as the HOA office assistant for 3 years, long enough to see everything and smart enough to document it. I cannot stay long, she said before I even sat down. If she finds out I am talking to you, I will lose more than my job. I assured her I would protect her identity, and something in her shoulders relaxed slightly. She reached into her purse and slid a USB drive across the table. Everything is on there. Emails between Brenda and her husband. The real budget spreadsheets, not the ones she shows at meetings. Text messages she thought were deleted. She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. There is one email from March 14th, 2023. She tells Richard to transfer $45,000 to their Cayman account, saying no one ever checks. That is your smoking gun. I thanked her and asked why she was risking everything to help me. Susan stared at her coffee for a long moment. Because I watched her destroy Harold Brennan. I watched her threaten people who asked questions. I watched her turn this community into her personal bank account, while everyone smiled and paid their dues. She stood up and gathered her things. I am tired of being afraid. Someone has to stop her. I just hope you are the one who can. She left without looking back, disappearing into the evening crowd on Main Street. I sat there for another 10 minutes, the USB drive heavy in my pocket, feeling the weight of what she had given me. This was no longer about my lake. This was about justice for an entire community that had been robbed blind for 7 years. I should have known Brenda would strike first. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and a text from my daughter that simply said, "Dad, call me immediately." I opened my laptop and found what she had seen. A post on the neighborhood community page, shared over 800 times in less than 12 hours. The headline read, "Warning, Garrett Mercer is a dangerous fraudster." Below it, Brenda had crafted a masterpiece of fabrication. She claimed I had been fired from my federal engineering position for corruption. She alleged I had a history of financial fraud in 3 states. She posted manipulated photos of my lake alongside images of environmental disasters, implying I was poisoning the groundwater. The comments section had become a feeding frenzy. Neighbors I had never spoken to were calling for my arrest. People were tagging law enforcement accounts, demanding an investigation. Someone had found the name of the consulting firm where I still worked part-time and posted their contact information with instructions to report me. The call from my employer came at 9:15 a.m. A woman from Human Resources explained in carefully neutral tones that my contract was being suspended pending an internal review of the allegations circulating online. The suspension meant immediate loss of my $3,500 monthly consulting income. I tried to explain that the accusations were fabricated, but she politely interrupted to say the company had no choice but to investigate before making any determinations. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. My daughter called next, her voice cracking as she described how her college friends had forwarded the posts, asking if her father was really a criminal. I told her the truth, that none of it was real, but I could hear in her silence that the damage had already been done. Reputation is not like a window you can simply replace. Once shattered, the pieces scatter in directions you cannot control. That night, I sat by the lake until 3 a.m., the same lake where I had scattered my wife's ashes 2 summers ago, for the first time since this began. I wondered if the fight was worth what it was costing me. Diana Ross called the next morning with an offer from Brenda's attorney. The HOA would drop all fines and withdraw the lawsuit if I agreed to fill in the lake and sign a non-disclosure agreement. I would lose approximately $150,000 in construction costs, but I would keep my home and end the public attacks. Diana's voice was neutral, professional. It is your decision, Garrett. No one would blame you for walking away. I looked out my window at the water, still and silver in the morning light, the place where my wife rested, the place I had built with my own hands to heal wounds that would never fully close. No, I said, I do not negotiate with thieves. I drafted a letter that afternoon and paid a courier service to deliver copies to all 312 households in Pinewood Ridge. The letter announced a special community meeting for the following Saturday at 2 p.m. in the community center. Subject: the truth about your HOA finances. That night, a brick crashed through my living room window. Wrapped around it was a note written in red marker, "Back off or regret it." 189 residents filled the community center on Saturday afternoon, more than had attended any HOA meeting in the neighborhood's 30-year history. Word had spread about my letter, and curiosity had proven stronger than loyalty to Brenda Whitmore. I stood at the front of the room with Frank Morrison on my left and a projector connected to my laptop on my right. A reporter from the Denver Post sat in the third row, notebook open, pen ready. Someone was live streaming from the back, and I could see the viewer count climbing on their phone screen. Brenda sat in the front row, arms crossed, her expression a mask of contempt that I suspected hid genuine fear. Her husband Richard sat beside her, shifting uncomfortably every few minutes. The 4 remaining board members flanked them like soldiers, unsure which side would win the coming battle. I began with the numbers. The projector displayed a timeline stretching from 2017 to 2024, each year marked with specific transactions that told the story of systematic theft. $247,000 for projects that never existed. $340,000 transferred to a company registered at Brenda's home address. $89,000 for security equipment that costs a fraction of the billed amount. I walked through each category methodically, showing the official budget beside the real expenses Frank and I had documented. The room grew quieter with each slide. I watched faces shift from skepticism to confusion to something darker. These were people who had paid their dues faithfully for years, trusting that their money was maintaining the community they loved. Now they were learning that trust had been betrayed. Then I showed them the email. The screen displayed a message dated January 15th, 2024, sent from Brenda Whitmore to her husband Richard, just 2 weeks before she filed the first complaint about my lake. The subject line read, "Mercer Problem, Dem," and the body contained words she had never expected anyone to see. I checked his permits. The lake is completely legal, but we need him gone before he starts asking questions about the books. I will manufacture violations and make his life miserable until he leaves or we can foreclose. Nobody fights the HOA and wins. The room erupted. Voices overlapped in waves of anger and disbelief. Someone in the back shouted for Brenda to explain herself. Another demanded to know where their money had gone. Brenda stood abruptly, her composure cracking for the first time since I had known her. "This is fabricated," she said, her voice rising above the noise. "He created these documents to frame me. He is the criminal here, not me." That was when Susan Palmer stood up from her seat near the exit. The room fell silent as she walked to the front, her steps steady despite the trembling in her hands. "My name is Susan Palmer. I worked in the HOA office for 3 years. I provided those emails to Mr. Mercer because I watched Mrs. Whitmore steal from this community for the entire time I worked there." She turned to face Brenda directly. "I saw the invoices you created for services we never received. I processed the checks to your husband's company. I know exactly what you did, because you made me help you do it." The silence that followed was absolute. Then 3 of the 4 board members rose from their seats and walked to the front of the room. One of them, a gray-haired woman named Patricia, who had served on the board for 5 years, spoke into the microphone with a voice that shook with barely controlled fury. "I hereby resign from the Pinewood Ridge HOA board. I did not know about these activities. and I refuse to be associated with them for another minute. The other two followed with similar statements. The reporter from the Denver Post was typing furiously now. The live stream had climbed past 2,000 viewers. I could feel the momentum shifting like a physical force. Years of accumulated power draining from Brenda Whitmore with every passing second. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. Richard closed behind, but Diana Ross stepped into her path, her expression calm and professional. Mrs. Whitmore, I have been retained as legal counsel for Mr. Mercer and several other residents affected by your conduct. This is a formal summons requiring your appearance at a civil hearing in 15 days regarding fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Brenda's face went pale as she took the document. Diana continued, her voice carrying across the now silent room. Additionally, I am authorized to inform you that the Colorado Attorney General's office has opened a formal criminal investigation based on evidence submitted 3 weeks ago. Brenda pushed past Diana and fled through the door without another word. As she disappeared into the parking lot, I noticed 2 figures in dark suits standing beside an unmarked sedan. One of them lifted a camera and photographed her as she ran to her car. Frank leaned close to me and whispered, "Those are federal agents. FBI Denver field office." The walls were closing in. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood gray and imposing against a cloudless October sky when I arrived at 8:45 a.m. 67 residents from Pinewood Ridge had made the drive to attend the civil hearing, filling the gallery behind me in a show of solidarity that would have seemed impossible just 2 months earlier. The Denver Post reporter occupied her usual spot in the 3rd row, joined now by camera crews from 2 local television stations. A representative from the Colorado Attorney General's office sat near the front, her presence a reminder that this civil proceeding was only the beginning of Brenda Whitmore's legal troubles. And in the back corner, almost invisible in their dark suits, 2 agents from the FBI Denver field office watched everything with the patient intensity of predators who knew their moment would come. The stage was set for a reckoning, 7 years in the making. Brenda sat at the defendant's table with her attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit who had already filed 3 motions for postponement. Judge Martha Caldwell, a 58-year-old jurist with a reputation for efficiency and zero tolerance for procedural games, had denied each one with increasing irritation. Richard Whitmore was notably absent, having been advised by his own attorney to distance himself from his wife's legal troubles. Diana Ross sat beside me, her case files organized with the precision of someone who had spent 15 years putting criminals behind bars. She had told me that morning that this hearing was about more than winning. It was about creating a public record so thorough that no one could ever question what had happened in Pinewood Ridge. The truth deserved witnesses. Harold Brennan took the stand first. He had flown in from Florida the previous day, determined to finally do what he had been too afraid to do 4 years ago. His voice was steady as he explained the double bookkeeping system he had discovered during his time as treasurer. He presented the original ledgers he had preserved, showing how Brenda had replaced them with sanitized versions after forcing him out. The numbers were devastating. 7 years of systematic theft, totaling $847,000, hidden behind phantom vendors and inflated budgets. When Brenda's attorney attempted to discredit him by suggesting he had created the documents himself, Harold simply pointed to the timestamps and file metadata. The original files predated his resignation by 18 months. There was no way he could have fabricated them after the fact. Susan Palmer testified next, her nervousness from our coffee shop meeting replaced by quiet determination. She walked the court through the internal emails she had provided, explaining the context behind each one. The message about transferring $45,000 to the Cayman account, the instructions to process payments to companies that existed only on paper. And finally, the smoking gun email where Brenda admitted my lake was legal and outlined her plan to manufacture violations. When Diana asked Susan why she had come forward, despite the personal risk, she turned to look at the gallery filled with her former neighbors. Because every person in this room trusted the HOA with their money, they deserved to know the truth, even if telling it cost me everything. Several people in the gallery wiped their eyes, I was not entirely sure my own remained dry. Frank Morrison delivered the financial analysis with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 3 decades uncovering corporate fraud. He walked the judge through each questionable expense, showing invoices for services never rendered alongside photographs, proving the work had never been done. The $67,000 road repair left the roads unchanged. The $89,000 in security equipment amounted to 4 cheap cameras. The $340,000 park renovation existed only in budget documents by the time he finished. The gallery had grown so still I could hear the court reporter's fingers clicking on her stenography machine. Judge Caldwell's expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something that looked very much like cold fury. Diana called me to the stand last. I presented my permits from Jefferson County, the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, and the EPA. All 3 had been approved before Brenda sent her first warning letter. Diana then cited Colorado Revised Statutes Section 38, Chapter 33.3, Subsection 117, which clearly stated that HOA enforcement authority extended only to structures within the designated common planning area. My lake sat entirely on privately deeded land, excluded from that area in the original 1994 subdivision plat. The HOA had never possessed the legal authority to fine me, place a lien on my property, or threaten foreclosure. Everything they had done was void from the beginning. Judge Caldwell called a 15-minute recess before delivering her ruling. When she returned, the courtroom fell silent. I have reviewed the evidence presented today, and my findings are unambiguous. The complaint filed by the Pinewood Ridge Homeowners Association against Mr. Garrett Mercer is legally groundless. The alleged violations, ranging from excessive frog noise to unapproved water coloration, have no basis in the community covenants and represent a deliberate abuse of process designed to harass a resident, exercising his lawful property rights. She paused, her gaze settling on Brenda. This court dismisses all claims against Mr. Mercer and refers this matter to the district attorney for consideration of criminal charges, including fraud, harassment, and abuse of legal process. Brenda shot to her feet before her attorney could stop her. "You do not understand," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "He is dangerous. He was going to expose everything. I was protecting this community." Judge Caldwell's gavel came down hard. "Mrs. Whitmore, I strongly advise you to remain silent. Anything you say in this courtroom can and will be used in the criminal proceedings that are clearly in your future." But the damage was already done. She had confessed her motive in front of 67 witnesses, 2 television cameras, and a reporter whose pen had not stopped moving. As the bailiff escorted her from the courtroom, the 2 FBI agents rose from their seats and followed, 3 months after the courtroom confrontation. The federal indictment came down like a hammer. Brenda Whitmore faced 7 criminal charges that painted a portrait of calculated greed spanning nearly a decade. Felony embezzlement, exceeding $100,000 under Colorado Criminal Code, Section 18, Chapter 4, Subsection 401. 3 counts of financial fraud, 2 counts of filing false statements, 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering through offshore accounts. The evidence Diana Ross had compiled, combined with the FBI's own investigation into the Cayman Island transfers, left no room for doubt. The judge presiding over the criminal case delivered a sentence that echoed through Pinewood Ridge like thunder. 9 years in federal prison, $847,000 in restitution, complete forfeiture of all assets obtained through fraudulent means. Richard Whitmore, who had tried to distance himself from his wife's crimes, received 4 years and a restitution order of $340,000 for his role in receiving stolen funds. The civil judgment in my favor arrived 2 weeks later. The court ordered the HOA to reimburse $47,500 in illegally collected fines, an additional $15,000 for emotional distress caused by deliberate harassment, $23,000 in legal fees I had incurred defending myself against baseless accusations. The total of $85,500 could never fully compensate for the sleepless nights, the damaged reputation, or the months of isolation from neighbors who had believed Brenda's lies. But it represented something more valuable than money. It represented acknowledgement that I had been wronged, and that the system, when forced to look closely, still recognized the difference between victim and perpetrator. The old HOA board dissolved completely within days of the verdict. A special election brought entirely new faces to every position, people who had watched the trial and understood what unchecked power could become. When the votes were counted, Frank Morrison had won the presidency with 89% support. His first official act was to propose a resolution that passed unanimously. The body of water on my property would henceforth be recognized by the community as Mercer Lake. The HOA formally acknowledged it had no jurisdiction over the lake and pledged never to challenge its existence again. When Frank called to tell me the news, his voice carried a lightness I had never heard from him before. "We took our community back, Garrett, because you refused to give up." Susan Palmer received a job offer the following week. The new board hired her as office manager at a salary significantly higher than what Brenda had paid her. She would oversee the complete audit of HOA finances going back 10 years, ensuring every dollar was accounted for, and every resident received restitution for fraudulent charges. 4 families discovered they had been overcharged for various invented violations, receiving a combined $34,000 in refunds. The consulting firm where I had worked part-time reviewed the evidence, cleared my name completely, and reinstated my contract with an apology and 3 months of back pay. The neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid me now waved and smiled. Some even stopped by to apologize. I accepted their words graciously, understanding that fear makes people do things they later regret. Harold Brennan flew up from Florida for the community celebration we held here in late November. He stood by the lake with tears in his eyes, finally free of the guilt that had haunted him for 4 years. "I should have fought," he said quietly. "I should have done what you did." I told him the truth. His documents had made the case. Without the evidence he preserved at great personal risk, none of this would have been possible. We were both fighters. He had simply been waiting for reinforcements. My daughter Emily drove up from college for the weekend, walking beside me along the shore as children from the neighborhood played on the dock I had built. "I am proud of you, Dad," she said, squeezing my hand. "You taught me that justice does not come to people who wait for it. You have to fight for it." I nodded, thinking of her mother, whose ashes rested in these waters. "But you fight the right way, with truth, with patience, with faith that the system can work when good people refuse to surrender." The following spring, I received a letter from Brenda Whitmore's new attorney. She was filing an appeal, claiming prosecutorial misconduct and tainted evidence. I set the letter on my kitchen table and walked outside to my fishing chair by the lake. The water shimmered gold in the afternoon light. Ducks paddled lazily near the cattails. Somewhere in a federal prison, a woman who had once commanded this community with absolute authority was learning what it felt like to have no power at all. I picked up my fishing rod and cast my line into the still water. The file containing 217 pages of documentation still sat beside my chair, ready if needed. They wanted to fight again. I had waited 20 years to use what I knew. I could wait a little longer. Justice does not knock on your door. You have to open it yourself with evidence, patience, and the courage to stand alone when everyone turns away. Garrett Mercer lost sleep, lost income, and nearly lost his home, but he never lost his resolve. When the powerful abuse their position, silence only makes them stronger. If this story reminded you that truth still wins, subscribe to Karma Neighbors and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us bring more stories of justice to light.